You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quirk,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have Matthew Quirk back on the show with me today. He was on a couple of years ago with his thriller debut, and a lot has happened since then. And The Night Agent, if you remember that show, and we'll link it up in the show notes of this episode, was one of my absolute favorite books of that year. And we've got some new news about The Night Agent, as well as a brand new book that we're here to talk about today, Red Warning. Matthew, thank you for taking time to come on the show with me today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So, Matthew, I've got a question that I've been asking people lately, and it's been kind of a fun way to get some conversation started. And is there a piece of writing advice that you got from someone, early in your career, or just something that stands out to you that was either a fantastic piece of writing advice and you look back on it regularly and think, oh, I'm so glad someone told me that, or and maybe there's both, but or is there a piece of advice that stands out to you because it was so horrifically wrong that it's just funny almost?
Oh, okay. Well, let me tackle the great advice first.
Okay.
I guess there's two pieces really that stick out. The first came from another podcast, actually, John August's podcast, which is more about screenwriting. But he once talked about how he pictures a scene, and he gets away from the computer and just sort of zones out and then pictures it, like visually, and then jots down what he sees. And he'll just sit until the whole, as I understand it, until the whole scene unreels in his mind. And that notion that you get away from the computer, really just zone out and let your imagination go, I found to be one of the most helpful pieces of advice I've gotten about writing, and also one of the most useful and like salutary, in that you don't have to be sitting staring at the cursor hunched over your keyboard all the time. So I will, at every phase of the book, when I'm trying to think of the whole plot, when I'm picturing a scene, I will actually just typically take a walk, although a lot of people get their ideas in the shower or laying down or whatever they're doing, but it'll come to me and then I'll write it down. And I find it's just easier to be creative when you're not staring at the computer, kind of glued to the keyboard. Although there are people who can really only think through their fingers. This is just me. And then I come back and write it down. And it really makes for a nice kind of workflow, in that I will sort of see, I'm outlining something. Now I'll be at a sort of critical moment in the outline, and I'll just go like lay in the backyard if I need to, and then let it come to me, and then come write it down. So that's the first one, sort of get away from the computer. And then I won't go into all the depth on this, but the idea that you should just write a really super duper rough first draft, which I'm sure you've heard from umpteen million people. I like to make sure that I outline pretty extensively, so I like to make sure that the story has good bones, and then I just write it quickly to get away from some of the sort of like perfectionism and stage fright that comes with writing, even when you've been doing it for a long time. So those are my two pieces of good advice. I'm trying to think of bad advice. Bad advice. No, I can't. I'll say one thing that might be related. My first book, The 500, did very well, and there was a lot of pressure on the second book. And a friend of mine, who had been sort of a mentor to me when I was breaking in, when he heard that I was under a lot of pressure for the second book, and I said, oh boy, I hope it doesn't I hope it goes well, and people hear about this sort of sophomore slump or the pressure to repeat a big success. And you can take 10 years to write your first book, and then you have a
Right.
year to write your second. And
Exactly.
he said to me, it's the third book that's the real dastardly. It's the third book's the toughest. So I said, oh, that's great. And I wrote the book and I handed it in, and then I had to rewrite it completely, and I was a mess after. And I went to him after I finished all the rewrites and everything, and I said, I thought you said the third book was the hardest. He goes, no, obviously the second book is the hardest, but that's what I tell people so they don't freeze up. So I just sort of like waltzed in front of machine gun fire. But it was good false advice. So maybe that sort of falls under the heading of your question.
That's hilarious. I heard someone talking about the dreaded sophomore slump, and they were talking about musicians, because exactly what you said. You can take 10 years to write that first book, but then you have 1 year to do the second. Well, the same way with musicians, a lot of times they've been woodshedding these songs for years in front of clubs and things like that, and that first album is usually just fire. And then the second one, and he said the second one is when they're picking out drapes for their new mansions and things, and so their heart's not in the same place as the first one was, which is hilarious. But yeah, I think we all get what you're saying there.
You have to stay hungry.
Yeah, stay hungry. Exactly. Well, speaking of staying hungry, when we talked last, it was 2019, and The Night Agent was just coming out, and I had the arc for several months before that, and I just loved that book, and I just couldn't say enough great things about it. And then after that book comes out, and then you're working on your follow-up book, this crazy thing happened, and a global pandemic hit, and everyone's life changed from there. I've been asking a lot of writers because, oddly enough, we spend most of our time at home, alone in an office anyway. And so you wouldn't think that everyone being locked down would have that big of an effect on writers who already work from home and work secluded anyway. But there's a weird mental thing that happens when the rest of the world is doing that as well. First off, how did you and your family fare during that time, and how did it affect you creatively?
Well, we fared pretty well in terms of work. We authors typically just like hide out at home for a year and then do 2 or 3 weeks of promotion,
Right.
which for a lot of us are sort of introverted extroverts or whatever you're going to call it. So it's nice because I'll do that. I'll see everybody I know as I travel on tour, and I'm good for a year, and then I can go
Fill
get
the
home.
tank up, and then you're
Yeah,
ready.
yeah. And my book came out, I don't know, 3 or 4 days before things really shut down with COVID, and I was at a great conference here called Left Coast Crime. And I, was sort of walking toward the hors d'oeuvres that were all laid out on these tables when the county came in and put an order on the hotel door that everyone had to go home.
Oh no!
And the buffet suddenly seemed not like it's like not the best idea.
Yeah.
So that tour, it was funny. It was just as things started getting crazy with COVID. So I was a little bit of the guinea pig with the bookstores all going to virtual events, and everybody was a trooper, but there were some like funny technical snafus. I was sideways in one interview. My voice was sped up like a chipmunk in one reading. But it was really impressive how everyone pivoted. And in terms of creativity, it didn't change much, because I just kind of hang out at home or write at home, and I just had more time, and there was no pressure to like go out really or anything like that. So I found it kind of helpful. Obviously, we got a little stir crazy and cabin feverish, but we had a baby. That was our pandemic hobby, which is sort of perfect, as you get a little older and you're in the midst of a global pandemic. It's nice to have a baby because it's the perfect at-home activity, and there's nothing I'd rather do more than just sit at home with the family now.
Absolutely. When we talked last, Matthew, you told us this great story about your time working in journalism and how maybe that wasn't the exact career that you were cut out for, because it was much more exciting for you to kind of embellish some or want to embellish some of these stories. And I think you had an editor that said, no, let's stick to the facts. Now that you write the kind of books that you do, and then you look at the headlines and you see that, some of your plots that you come up with are not so far-fetched. That's kind of an odd kind of full circle moment that it's kind of fun to embellish the news and to make it more sexy, and then to find out that the fiction you write is in danger of becoming reality too often. That's got to be it's got to be interesting to read the news knowing the kinds of books that you write.
It is, and it's obviously the wellspring of a lot of ideas.
Right.
When I started this, it felt like politics was much less crazy, and the thrillers were very much amped up, sexed up versions of reality. The idea that somebody would kind of kill someone in politics was really over the top. But now it's, you have crazy things. You have, riots on Capitol Hill. You have, foreign meddling in elections. You have all kinds of crazy stuff. You have a full-on land war in Europe. So it's funny now. As a practical matter, you need to be typically in these books sort of relevant to what's happening, but also you need to future-proof the book a little bit because it takes a year to write and a year to come out. So you can't possibly chase. It's like driving, piloting an aircraft carrier. So, but that, it sort of helps you be more creative. I've had books like The Night Agent that were almost overtaken by events, and then it forces you to give them a little twist, and then that future-proofed that book, and also I think made it a better book. And, in terms of more generally what these stories do, it's wild now that reality has become so far beyond, in terms of like the outrageousness of events that happen all the time. It's beyond what I imagine, and in some ways it outstrips what typically happens in thrillers. So I found myself returning to this idea, and I wrote an essay about this for Vox, that the books can give us some sense of order and meaning and closure, and we really are drawn to them because they can give us a sense of sort of right and wrong, and that they're being like logic and justice to the world, or at least to the stories. So I find that aspect of fiction to be a little bit more salient right now.
When the new book first came out, I saw that Jack Carr had blurbed it, and love Jack Carr. He's a great friend. But he said intricately plotted with extraordinary characters and riveting action. And when you mentioned earlier about how you like to sort of plan out the beginning of the book, when I see someone say that a book is intricately plotted, when they say that about someone else's book, I think what they're meaning is the story is very tight, and there's a lot of seemingly well-planned misdirection, and things are happening that you can't see coming. With the type of planning that you do, do you know when you first sit down to start your draft after you've kind of done your outlining and all of that, are you the kind of writer that likes to work out all of the problems ahead of time so that the drafting just comes It is more like putting skin on the bones there, or are there opportunities where the writing still surprises you, even though you have done your pre-planning work? You've been so dedicated to that up front. Is there room where the story can still be a little wild to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about kind of striking a balance. I tend to outline, and in terms of misdirection and plotting, I like to have a sense of that so you can, lay the pieces in. And I should say Jack Carr is just like a tremendous, great guy, and I was fortunate enough to meet him a little bit while he was kind of breaking in. And yeah, and then it's just nobody has ever worked so hard to deserve success like he has. So that's been a
Sure.
thrill to watch. Um, and as far as plotting, yeah, I like to figure out the sort of main signposts so I can do the misdirection. And if it's something that will touch on in important structural ways other parts of the book, I'd like to have that figured out in advance. But it's not something like then when I sit to write the first draft, I'm simply sort of like, painting and sanding, like just finishing up stuff. It's really the scene to scene stuff. I know, for instance, that the hero will get out here, will escape here, or there'll be a big surprise and this person betrays this person. And then when I sit down to write that scene, I have no idea how that will happen. So that's how I like to do things, where I'm confident that the whole plot will work. And that makes me a little bit more relaxed enough to really spend my creativity on the particulars of that scene. It's kind of tactics and strategy or something like that. And what I've been doing more, I used to outline, and I used to outline by trying to sort of like, this is hard to convey, but I would like plant big flags where the story needs to go,
Sure.
based on twists and that sort of thing. And now I do an outline where I'm sort of at a kind of ground eye view with the main character. And I'm outlining, I'm just writing down what'll happen in these scenes, but I'm really just thinking, okay, then what happens? Okay, then what happens? Instead of saying like, oh, I need this person to make sure that they, know that the FBI is going to betray them 60 pages from here. So I found that sort of going by the seat of your pants at an outline phase where you're just writing down what happens in each scene in like what most people would do like with an index card. I found that's the best way to be able to get your story down without writing the whole darn thing,
Yeah.
and also keep some of the spontaneity and logic. Because if you're a big outliner and you have software like Dabble or Scrivener, it's really easy to lay out all these things, and then when you're actually going through those scenes and writing it from the point of view of the character, sometimes it doesn't make sense or it's forced. So that's something I've been doing more and more, getting away from all these sort of screenplay beats and milestones and doing things more from the sort of character ground level view.
Are you the kind of writer that needs to have a particular space to write? That some people have their writing space and they hold that almost sacred. Other people can grab a laptop and sit in the middle of a crowded, noisy room and just fall into the story there. They're able to just block everything out. Do you fall into one of those two extremes, or are you somewhere in the middle?
Oh, it's definitely the former. I need a pretty quiet place. And my joke about this, The Shining, where he's Jack Nicholson's character is losing his mind,
Yes.
and his very kind wife like offers to bring him a sandwich, and he goes completely insane.
Yes.
And most people watch that movie and they're terrified because obviously this is a violent psychopath. And then I watch the movie, I'm like, I mean, maybe he had a groove going, not to justify anything he did.
Right.
So I do like
Cut him some slack.
Yeah. I mean, he had all work and no play. That's a great line. He was at a groove going. So I do like. I don't do music. I like total silence, and in terms of like writing tips people maybe can use, you can either force the world to be silent or take measures related to your ears that will give you silence and let you
Right.
concentrate. And this is sort of a new aspect because my wife and I worked from home in like this 1-bedroom apartment when I was first started writing. So earplugs are amazing, noise canceling headphones are amazing. Both together are almost impermeable. And my little trick, if I'm like trying to write on an airplane or they're doing construction next door, which they are, is earplugs, noise canceling headphones over them. And then if you play white noise through the noise canceling headphones, somebody could be doing target practice next to your head and you wouldn't hear. So I can sort of work in a house full of the full carnival of family life and do that and have a pretty isolated space. Yeah.
I'm just jotting down earplugs, white noise, target practice. Got it.
But like a tornado could pull your house away. So,
Right.
You need to take some safety precautions first.
Look up every couple of minutes to make sure the roof is still intact and go for it. You've had some pretty exciting news in the last month or two about The Night Agent coming to the screen. What's going on with The Night Agent?
They are about to finish filming it this week. And I went up to the set last week, sort of like in the midst of book tour, to check everything out. And it was one of the coolest things I've ever done. So that's, I'm just kind of thrilled and grateful and all about that because it's really hard to get a television show made. And I now understand why. It's just an extraordinary outlay of resources and work and
a lot of moving parts.
Time. I now have some idea, but it is, it's like, it's a decamillion kind of thing to get. That's why it's so hard to get something made. And then you see what that looks like. I pulled up to the set and there were hundreds and hundreds of people there. And it gave me butterflies when I saw The Night Agent and then saw this like, battalion sized operation. It makes you really appreciate the risk people are taking and the amount of work that goes into television and the talent of the people who do it. I watched them do a
5-minute
scene and it took 14 hours.
Oh my goodness.
It was really something.
So to kind of call back to some of that writing advice that you talked about when we first started talking, where someone gave you the advice to kind of step back and to visualize the scene that you're writing and to get a different perspective on it so that you could see it, then sit down and describe what it is that you saw, to then go to a set to literally visualize how someone has taken your words and now interpreted them to the way they see it. That has to be a surreal experience.
It's really cool. The first moment where I got those butterflies was seeing the script. The showrunner, Sean Ryan, is just an incredibly great, nice guy. And, most people sort of joke that like Hollywood keeps you at arm's length, or, they refer you to the movie Barton Fink to see how authors will be treated. But actually, I've been like treated incredibly well. And everyone's been super nice to me. And so he sent me the pilot and, I had scenes from the book, and then I looked at the pilot, and some of them were basically just, moved over. And then the cool thing about the show is that Sean Ryan had his own story that he's sort of combines, which hopefully will sustain this world of the series for, God willing, many years. But yeah, seeing something you wrote just turned straight into a TV scene is such a thrill because I don't know. I had this feeling about books where they were almost this magical thing that came down from on high. And I remember the first time I got a signed book and it was like a sacred thing to me. And now I write books, so it's more, it's been disenchanted a little bit, or at least I'm used to it. And then, I have that feeling about TV and film. And so to go and to just see your stuff turned into that is really, really fascinating. And then to see these characters you wrote just walking around and talking to each other and, pulling guns on people. It's so cool. It's absolutely cool. And, it was near the end of the shoot and they work really long hours and, some days went late. And I was just, the whole time I was just like sitting there with my mind blown by the whole enterprise.
That is so awesome. Your new book, Red Warning. Who is CIA officer Sam Hudson?
He is a deep cover officer, technically known as a non-official cover officer, who has been chasing a Russian deep cover officer, a sleeper, named Konstantin for years. And, some folks even think that Konstantin is sort of a legend, kind of like a Kaiser Soze type figure. And he's on the trail of him in Geneva. When something goes wrong, he gets burned and he comes back to DC to lick his wounds a little bit. He's on the outs with the sort of senior intelligence executives. And then it turns out that the threat from abroad has followed it home. And there's some scenes of sort of iconic buildings around DC where he and Konstantin get themselves into what I hope is, a classic spy cat and mouse story.
Is it getting to be more difficult to tell these classic spy cat and mouse stories the way technology is advancing now? Or does the advancing technology make it easier to tell this sort of? Do you have more tools in your toolbox, so to speak? Does the advancement of technology, does that factor in to this type of narrative?
Oh, it certainly does. And as a matter of reality, intelligence officers have had to completely change everything because there's so much biometric stuff and people have such an online footprint that you can't make up a person and you can't pretend to be a dead person. And so those are no longer options. And that used to be sort of the playbook. And also just, ubiquitous surveillance means that, like you can't even do a dead drop. So, in reality, the spying has completely changed. And I think what they do more now is they take somebody who's a real person and they'll use them for a one-off in a sort of denied area, because then they'll have a normal background in social media. They won't stand out. And then you can only use someone once. So that's, as I understand it. And, what I like to do with the fiction is to really understand what's happening in reality. And then when you sit down to do the fiction, to feel free to make it up, because there's great nonfiction. And I do like to get across a lot of the authenticity and the real facts of how the work is done. But at the end of the day, people are sitting down for like a spy story. And if being strictly 100% accurate to current CIA procedures means that your story is going to be boring, which it might, then, I feel free to bring in elements that'll, give us more action and that kind of thing. And that's something I did sort of early in the career, where I was obsessed with authenticity. And I was talking to all these folks who do cool secret squirrel jobs in the military and intelligence world. And they were like, well, what we do day in, day out, we try to keep it boring so that we're not like cornered. You don't send
Right.
one guy to take a house in Afghanistan. And we have air support and quick reaction forces. And if we do a surveillance job on somebody, we have 200 people, and they said, so you write the books and we do the work and we know what that's like. And we love the books. So it can be larger than life. So my quest for authenticity led me to feeling licensed to be a little inauthentic. So that's sort of how you tackle authenticity issue. And the interesting thing for this book, though, is that the Russian bad guys who were Soviet intelligence officers came over before all of that. They came over in the old days. And what's interesting in this book is that the plots were sort of hatched at the height of the Cold War, and they're based on real plots and real testimony from Soviet defectors, like colonels from one colonel from military intelligence, who said that, the Soviet Union had sort of laid out and prepared the ground for these sabotage plots against the U.S. or D.C. that could be used in the case of World War III. And, there are spies from the Soviet days who stuck around after the Soviet Union fell. And the cool thing, some of them haven't ever been back. So they're still in that mindset. And I mean, another interesting wrinkle to this is some of them came over and then the Soviet Union fell. And, Vladimir, the Russian sleeper, had been pretending to be Joe with a trucking business in Hyattsville, Maryland. And some of the Soviet sleepers actually just became their identity and became Americans and sort of quietly defected to the U.S. without telling anybody and melted into their real life. So there's a lot of neat stuff, and that retro aspect to this book helped get around some of these new technical difficulties of spying in the age of ubiquitous surveillance.
Red Warning is a book that you absolutely must go out and grab today. Not if you're looking to have a peaceful, quiet weekend. This is not that book. But it is a fun book for sure. It's one of my favorite thrillers of this year. Red Warning is available everywhere now. You can grab it in hardcover or Kindle edition, or hold the or audiobook if you prefer to listen that way. We're going to have links to it in the show notes of this episode. Matthew, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you do, where can they find you online?
MatthewQuirk.com, and I think my Facebook thing is Matthew Quirk Author, all one word, and mquirk is my Twitter name, but just MatthewQuirk.com, and then you can find links to everything in there.
Excellent. We'll link up all those places to make it easier for folks to find you. Matthew, love what you're doing. Red Warning, a fantastic book, and I can't recommend it highly enough. Thank you so much for taking time to come back on the show.
Oh, thanks for talking. Yeah, it was a pleasure.